The air in Illinois Corvo was thick with respect. It was a commodity more valuable than the aged scotch in the crystal glasses or the gold leaf on the ceiling. It clung to one man. Marco Bellini. He sat in the corner booth, the one permanently reserved for him, a ghost in a tailored suit. His presence was a quiet weight, a gravity that bent the room around him. Waiters moved with silent urgency. The owner, a man named Gianni, hovered at a respectful distance, his face a mask of anxious hospitality. Marco did not command this deference with loud words or grand gestures. He did not need to. His reputation was a shadow that preceded him everywhere, a story told in whispers in the city's dark corners. He was a man of order, of rules. His world was one of brutal logic. Tonight, he was concluding business. Across from him sat two men, their own expensive suits seeming cheap and ill-fitting in his presence. They spoke of shipments and territories. Marco listened. His eyes, dark and unreadable, missed nothing. His lieutenant, Nico, stood a few feet away, a statue of loyalty, his gaze sweeping the room, anticipating threats that would never dare to materialize here. This was Marco's sanctuary. A young waiter, new and nervous, approached the table to refill the water glasses. Gianni intercepted him with a sharp, almost invisible shake of the head. Only Gianni's most senior staff were permitted to approach Mr. Bellini's table. That was the rule. Another rule in a life built on them. Marco raised a hand, a subtle gesture, and the men across from him fell silent. The deal was done. He gave a slight nod. Nico stepped forward, placing a leather portfolio on the table. It was done. As the two men, visibly relieved, prepared to depart, a small commotion occurred near the service entrance. A hesitation. A hushed, frantic exchange between Gianni and a waitress. Marco's eyes flickered toward the disturbance, his focus momentarily broken. He saw the waitress. And the world stopped. She was not young. Her face was etched with a tiredness that soap and water could not wash away. Her uniform was clean but worn, the fabric thinned from 1,000 washings. Her hair was pulled back in a simple, severe knot, but a few stray strands had escaped, framing a face he knew better than his own. A face he had not seen in 20 years. Lena. She held a water pitcher, her knuckles white. She was arguing with Gianni, her voice a low, desperate murmur he could not hear but could feel. Gianni was shaking his head, trying to steer her back toward the kitchen. But she took a step forward. Then another. She was walking toward his table. Nico tensed, his hand instinctively moving to the inside of his jacket. A breach in protocol. A serious one. No one approached Marco Bellini uninvited. No one. As she drew closer, Marco raised his hand again, this time toward Nico. The motion was slow, deliberate. Stay. Nico froze, his expression a mixture of confusion and alarm. He had never seen his boss look this way. The mask of cold control had cracked, and for a fraction of a second, something raw and vulnerable showed through. The two business associates, halfway out of their seats, sank back down, unsure of the new script. Lena stopped at the edge of the table. She did not seem to recognize him at first. She just saw the power. The expensive suit. The man everyone in the room feared. Her eyes, the same shade of weary blue he remembered from a lifetime ago, were fixed on him. "Mr. Bellini," she asked, her voice trembling but clear. The sound of his name on her lips was a ghost touching his skin. He simply stared. The boy he had been and the man he had become collided within him, a silent, violent impact. She did not wait for an answer. She took a shaky breath, her desperation overriding the terror that was plain on her face. "I need to hire you." The two men at the table exchanged glances of disbelief. Nico took a half-step forward before Marco's subtle gesture stopped him again. Silence descended on the booth, a pocket of stunned quiet in the bustling restaurant. Then, she looked at him. Really looked at him. A flicker of confusion, of dawning, horrifying recognition. Her face paled. Marco, she whispered, the name a fragile thing in the heavy air. It was not a question. It was a lament. Stay with me until the end, because what happens next will redefine the meaning of a second chance. If you enjoy stories that explore the depths of loyalty and redemption, make sure to like this video and hit that subscribe button so you never miss a new tale. And let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Now, let's get started. Marco Bellini was not his birth name. He was born Marco Gallo, a skinny kid from the wrong side of the tracks, with nothing to his name but a fierce heart and a pair of perpetually scraped knuckles. His world was small then. It consisted of a cramped apartment that always smelled of garlic and his mother's worry, the cracked pavement of his street, and the fire escape outside his window. That fire escape was his kingdom. And Lena was his queen. She lived 2 floors down. They spent their summers on that rusted metal perch, their legs dangling over the alley, sharing dreams as big as the sky. They were going to escape. He was going to be an architect, building beautiful things instead of breaking them. She was going to be a dancer, graceful and free. They would buy a small house by the sea, far away from the sirens and the shouting. He had promised her. He promised he would always protect her. It was the first and most important promise he had ever made. Then came the night that promise was tested. A group of older boys, drunk on cheap wine and their own cruelty, had cornered her in the alley. Marco, 16 and wiry, had heard her cry out. He hadn't thought. He had just moved. The fight was a blur of blind fury. He fought with a desperation that terrified the other boys. When it was over, he was bruised and bleeding, but he was standing. And Lena was safe. He had kept his promise. But when she looked at him, her eyes were not filled with gratitude. They were filled with fear. She wasn't looking at her Marco, the boy who dreamed of building things. She was looking at the violence. The darkness he had unleashed. This life, she had whispered, her voice shaking. I can't be near this, Marco. 2 weeks later, her family moved away without a word. The fire escape became just a fire escape. His kingdom had crumbled. The dreams of being an architect died with it. If the world only understood violence, then he would learn to speak its language fluently. He started small, running errands for local toughs. His ferocity and intelligence got him noticed. He learned the rules of the street, the cold calculus of power and fear. He took the name Bellini, his mother's maiden name, burying Marco Gallo along with his broken heart. He rose through the ranks with a chilling efficiency. He was smarter, more disciplined, and more ruthless than his rivals. He built an empire not on chaos, but on order. His order. His word was law. His punishments were swift and final. He became the ghost, a man who solved problems permanently. But he lived by a code. It was a twisted version of the promise he had made on that fire escape. He protected what was his. He never involved civilians. Women and children were off limits, a sacred line no one in his organization was ever allowed to cross. Violating that rule was a death sentence. It was the last, frayed thread connecting him to the boy he had been. Now, that boy's ghost sat across from him, wearing the tired face of the woman he had lost. After that first night, Marco had dismissed his associates and sat alone at the table. Gianni, sweating, had rushed over. Mr. Bellini, I am so sorry. She is new. She will be disciplined. She will be gone. Marco had looked up, his eyes like chips of ice. No. The word was quiet, but it landed with the force of a hammer blow. She stays, Marco said. And from now on, this is her section. Only her. Gianni just nodded, his face a mess of confusion and terror. And so it began. Every night for a week, Marco Bellini came to Illinois Corvo. He sat in his booth, sometimes with Nico, sometimes alone. And Lena served him. She was terrified. Her hands shook so badly the first few nights that she almost dropped the plates. She never made eye contact. She spoke only when necessary, her voice a strained whisper. "Would you care for a drink, mister? Are you ready to order?" She never used his name again. Not his first, not his last. He was just a mister. A client. A threat. He watched her. He saw the worn-out shoes, the faint tremor in her hands that spoke of exhaustion. He saw the way she would slip a bread roll into her apron when she thought no one was looking. He saw the deep, abiding sadness in her eyes. This was not the vibrant, laughing girl from the fire escape. Life had been relentlessly cruel to her. The thought was a hot coal in his chest. He had built an empire to insulate himself from the world's chaos, yet he had done nothing to protect the one person he had sworn to. For her part, Lena was living in a quiet nightmare. Serving Marco was a torment. Each time she approached his table, her heart hammered against her ribs. He was a specter from a life she had run from, now sitting in judgment of the life she had ended up in. She had married a good man, a carpenter named David. They had a son, Leo. They were happy, if not wealthy. Then David had gotten sick. A cancer that ate through their savings and then their hope. He had been gone for 2 years. Now it was just her and Leo. And Leo was sick. Not like his father, thank God. A chronic respiratory condition that required expensive medications and regular visits to a specialist. Every dollar she earned went to keeping her son breathing. She worked 2 jobs, this waitressing gig and cleaning offices early in the morning. She barely slept. She lived in a constant state of gnawing anxiety. And then there was Sal Vitoli, her landlord. A portly, sweating man with greasy hair and eyes that lingered on her for too long. She was 2 months behind on rent. He knew it. He enjoyed it. He would knock on her door at odd hours, ostensibly to talk about the rent. "A pretty woman like you," he'd say, leaning against the doorframe, blocking her exit. "We could work something out." She had refused, her voice tight with disgust. His smile had turned ugly. "Suit yourself. End of the week. I want the money, or you and the kid are on the street." That was yesterday. The end of the week was 2 days away. She had no money. No one to turn to. That desperation had led her to Marco Bellini's table. She had heard the whispers in the kitchen. Who he was. What he did. They said he could solve any problem. In a moment of sheer, blind panic, she had thought, maybe he could help. She didn't have a plan. She just knew she had to do something. Then she had recognized him, and the floor had fallen out from under her. The one person in the world she never wanted to see again. The one person who represented the violence she had spent her life trying to escape. Now, she was trapped, forced to serve him night after night, the ghost of their shared past hanging between them, thicker than the cigar smoke from the other tables. On the 7th night, it happened. A customer at a nearby table, a loudmouth tourist, complained that his steak was overcooked. He was rude, obnoxious. Lena apologized, her face flushed with humiliation. As she turned to take the plate back to the kitchen, he made a crude comment and reached out, grabbing her arm. Lena flinched back, and the plate slipped from her grasp, crashing to the floor. Red wine and steak sauce splattered across the white-tiled floor. Silence. The man started shouting. Gianni came running. From his booth, Marco watched, his face impassive. But inside, a cold, familiar rage began to build. Nico saw the subtle clenching of his boss's jaw. He knew that look. It was the look that preceded terrible things. Gianni, eager to placate the loud customer and terrified of the silent one, turned on Lena. "You are clumsy. Incompetent," he hissed, his face purple. "You are fired. Get out." Lena just stood there, swaying slightly, the fight gone out of her. She looked broken. Utterly broken. She mumbled an apology, turned, and walked toward the kitchen, her shoulders slumped in defeat. Marco placed his napkin on the table. He stood up. He walked over to the tourist, who was still puffing out his chest. Marco didn't say a word. He just looked at him. The man's bravado evaporated. He shrank in his chair, the color draining from his face as he seemed to finally realize who was standing before him. Marco then turned his gaze to Gianni. The owner began to tremble. "Mr. Bellini." "I?" Marco said nothing. He simply held Gianni's gaze for a long, silent moment. The message was clear. "You have made a grave error." Then, Marco turned and walked out of the restaurant. Nico followed, dropping a few $100 bills on their table without breaking stride. The silence Marco left behind was more profound than any shout. Marco sat in the back of his black sedan, the engine idling silently. He watched the alleyway beside the restaurant. "Boss?" Nico asked from the front seat. "What are we doing?" "Waiting," Marco said, his voice flat. A few minutes later, the alley door opened. Lena emerged, stripped of her uniform, now wearing a thin coat over a faded dress. She was holding a small, brown paper bag containing her meager belongings. She leaned against the cold brick wall, wrapped her arms around herself, and began to cry. Not loud, hysterical sobs. Silent, shoulders-shaking tears of absolute despair. The sight of it broke through 20 years of ice and steel in Marco's chest. This was his fault. His presence in the restaurant had put her under a microscope. His inaction had allowed this to happen. He had promised to protect her, and all he had done was bring his darkness back into her life, causing it to collapse. The boy on the fire escape screamed in his memory. He thought of his own rules. Stay detached. Do not get involved in civilian matters. Emotions are a liability. He had lived by those rules for 2 decades. They had kept him alive. They had made him powerful. He looked at Lena, alone and broken in the alley. The rules turned to dust. He thought of her face, 20 years younger, full of hope. He thought of her hand in his, her head on his shoulder, the shared whisper of a future that never was. He had lost that girl. He would not fail this woman. He made the choice. It was not a choice made with logic or reason. It was made in the heart of a 16-year-old boy who was still bleeding in an alley, having kept his promise. Marco leaned forward, his voice low and hard, all emotion wrung from it. "Nico." "Boss." "Find out everything," Marco commanded. "Everything about her. Where she lives. Who she owes. Every problem she has. I want a full report on my desk by morning." Nico turned to look at him, his brow furrowed in deep concern. This was unprecedented. "Boss, with respect, this isn't our world. This is personal." Marco's gaze was fixed on Lena, who was now wiping her eyes, trying to compose herself before heading home to her son. "It is now," Marco said, his voice leaving no room for argument. He then issued a second set of commands, mobilizing a different part of his organization. A team that specialized in information. The best hackers and investigators money could buy. He wanted to know about Sal Vitoli. His finances. His business partners. His weaknesses. His sins. "I want to own the man before the sun comes up," Marco said, the words cold and precise. Nico simply nodded. The questions in his eyes were replaced by the familiar look of resolute loyalty. His boss had given an order. It would be done. As the car pulled away from the curb, Marco allowed himself one last look at Lena. She was walking away, a solitary figure disappearing into the city's uncaring darkness. Not for long, he thought. The dawn is coming. The next morning, Marco sat in his office. It was a sterile, minimalist space at the top of a skyscraper, offering a panoramic view of the city he controlled. On his vast, empty desk were 2 files. The first was about Lena. Nico had been thorough. The report detailed her husband's death, her son's illness, the 2 jobs, the crushing debt. It painted a picture of a woman clinging to survival by a thread. Every line he read was a fresh stab of guilt. The second file was on Sal Vitoli. It was thicker. Vitoli was a bottom feeder, a slumlord who preyed on the desperate. The file was filled with evidence of illegal evictions, extortion, and harassment. He had dozens of victims, all people like Lena, trapped and powerless. But the most damning information was financial. Vitoli was laundering money for a rival family, the Falcones. A stupid, greedy man playing a dangerous game. Marco closed the files. He had everything he needed. The plan was simple. It was elegant. It was final. He buzzed for his lieutenant. "Nico! Get the car. And bring the quiet boys. We're paying a visit to a landlord." Sal Vitoli's office was in a rundown building in a part of town the police tended to avoid. The sign on the door just said AV Properties. It was after midnight. The building was dark and silent. Marco's men had disabled the alarms and picked the lock in under a minute. They were professionals. They moved with a silent, coordinated grace that was far more terrifying than any overt display of force. Marco, Nico, and two other men, large and impassive, entered the office. Vitoli was there, as Marco knew he would be. He was counting cash at his desk, a bottle of cheap whiskey beside him. He looked up, his eyes widening in alarm as the four men filled his doorway. "Who the hell are you?" he blustered, trying to sound tough. "What is this? A robbery?" Marco stepped forward into the dim light of the desk lamp. Recognition dawned on Vitoli's face, followed by pure, cold terror. He knew who Marco Bellini was. Everyone knew. Mr. Bellini, he stammered, pushing himself back in his chair. I don't understand. I pay my dues. I have an arrangement with the Falcones." Mentioning the rival family was a mistake. A stupid, fatal mistake. "The Falcones cannot help you now," Marco said, his voice a low, calm whisper that was more menacing than any shout. He walked around the desk and stood over Vitoli. He didn't touch him. He just looked down at him with an expression of profound disappointment. "You have a tenant," Marco began, his tone conversational. "A woman named Lena Russo. A son named Leo. Apartment 3B. Vitoli's face went slack with confusion and fear. "Her? What does she have to do with you?" "She has nothing to do with me," Marco said, a statement that was both a lie and the deepest truth. "But you have something to do with her. You threatened her. You threatened her child. You disrespected her." Marco leaned down slightly, his voice dropping even lower. "There are rules in this city, Sal. My rules. You do not prey on the weak. You do not harm women and children. It is a simple rule. A line. And you crossed it." Vitoli started to sweat profusely, his eyes darting toward the door. "It was a misunderstanding," he pleaded, his voice cracking. "Just business. She owed me money." "She owes you nothing," Marco stated. He gestured to Nico, who stepped forward and placed a briefcase on the desk. He opened it. It was filled with documents. "As of an hour ago," Nico explained in a monotone, "the bank that holds the notes on your properties called in your debt. All of it. A holding company I control purchased that debt. Which means, Sal, that you no longer own these buildings." "I do." He paused, then added, "And my first order of business is to forgive the back rent of every single one of your tenants." Vitoli stared at the papers, his face collapsing as he understood. He was ruined. "But that's not all," Marco continued softly. He picked up a piece of paper from Vitoli's desk, a ledger of his illegal transactions with the Falcones. "This is unfortunate. Laundering money. For my competitors. You are not only a predator, Sal. You are a traitor and a fool." Vitoli began to sob, a pathetic, blubbering sound. Please, Mr. Bellini. I'll do anything. I'll leave town. You'll never see me again. Marco looked at him for a long moment, his face a mask of stone. Yes, he said. You are right about that. He straightened up and looked at his two quiet men. Your business with the Falcones is now concluded. Permanently. Make sure he won't be bothering anyone ever again. The two men moved forward. Vitali let out a choked scream. Marco turned and walked out of the office without looking back. Nico followed him. As they stepped out into the cold night air, Nico spoke, his voice quiet. The Falcones will hear about this. I want them to, Marco replied. I want them to know what happens when someone breaks the rules. The problem of Sal Vitali was closed. Now, for the resolution. 2 days later, Lena received a letter. It was from a law firm she had never heard of, summoning her to their downtown office. Terrified, thinking it was another debt collector, she went. She was shown into a plush conference room. Marco was waiting for her. He was alone. He stood when she entered, looking just as out of place as she felt among the polished mahogany and leather-bound books. She stopped in the doorway, her heart pounding. Marco! What is this? Please, sit down, Lena, he said, his voice gentle. She hesitated, then slowly sat at the far end of the long table. He didn't sit. He remained standing, keeping his distance. I heard what happened at the restaurant, he began. I am sorry. She just stared, not knowing what to say. I also heard about your housing situation. Lena flinched. Vitali, he hasn't been back. I don't understand. You don't have to worry about Mr. Vitali anymore, Marco said simply. He slid a folder across the polished table toward her. What is this? She whispered. Open it. With trembling hands, she opened the folder. Inside was the deed to her apartment. Her name was on it. Under purchase price, it said, paid in full. Behind it was a bank statement for a new account, also in her name. The balance was enough to cover Leo's medical care for the next 20 years. And then some. She looked up at him, her eyes wide with disbelief and a dawning, terrifying understanding. Tears welled in her eyes, but they were not tears of sadness. How? She breathed. Why? He walked over to the window, looking out at the city below. I made you a promise a long time ago, Lena. On a fire escape. I told you I would protect you. I failed. For 20 years, I failed. This is me, trying to keep my word. Late. She stood up and walked toward him, stopping a few feet away. The fear was gone from her eyes, replaced by a profound, searching curiosity. She was looking at him, really looking at him, for the first time since she was a girl. She saw the lines of regret around his eyes, the deep loneliness he could not hide. The things they say about you are the stories, she said softly. Are they true? What are you, Marco? Are you a bad guy? He turned from the window to face her. His expression was unguarded for the first time, a flash of the boy she once knew. A sad, tired smile touched his lips. I am what I have to be, he said, his voice thick with unspoken history. He paused, his gaze holding hers. But this week, for you, I got to be the good guy. The honesty of it hung in the air between them. It was a confession. An apology. A farewell. She took a step closer. She didn't know what he had done to Vitali, and she knew she should not ask. She only knew that the monster that had been haunting her was gone. And this man, this ghost from her past, had banished it. You can't buy back what we lost, Marco, she said, her voice gentle but firm. I know, he said quietly. This isn't for that. This is for Leo. It's for you. So you can be free. Like you wanted. He reached into his pocket and took out a simple, plain white business card. On it was a single phone number. Nothing else. He held it out to her. For anything, he said. If you or Leo ever need anything. No matter what. You call this number. She took the card, her fingers brushing his. A spark. A memory of holding hands on a summer night. Thank you, Marco, she said, her voice clear and strong. He simply nodded, the mask of the formidable Mr. Bellini settling back over his features. He walked to the door, his duty done. He had kept his promise. He had built something. Not with steel and glass, but with a single, decent act. He paused at the door, his back to her. Goodbye, Lena. And then he was gone. 5 years passed. The city moved on. The world turned. Lena's life had transformed. With the crushing weight of debt lifted, she had been able to focus solely on Leo. With the best care, his condition stabilized and then improved. He was a bright, happy boy, his laughter filling the small apartment that was now truly their home. Lena had gone back to school. She had always loved to bake, a passion she had inherited from her mother. She took a course in pastry arts. She discovered she had a talent for it. A year later, she used the remaining money to open a small bakery in a quiet, sun-drenched neighborhood. Lena's place. It was a success. People loved her breads, her cakes, her warm smile. She was no longer the tired, frightened woman from the restaurant. She was confident. She was happy. She was free. She still had the card with the single phone number on it. She kept it tucked away in a small wooden box with a few other precious mementos, a photograph of her husband, a lock of Leo's baby hair. She never used it. She never needed to. But knowing it was there was a quiet comfort, a reminder that in the darkest moment of her life, a ghost from her past had reached out and pulled her into the light. Far away, in his glass tower overlooking the city, Marco Bellini sat behind his desk. His empire was larger than ever. His power was absolute. He was feared and respected. He was utterly alone. His office was as sterile and minimalist as ever, a reflection of the man he presented to the world. But there was one new item. On the corner of his vast desk, propped up against a pen holder, was a small, framed object. It was not a priceless artifact or a trophy from a defeated rival. It was a photograph, slightly faded, taken with a cheap camera more than 2 decades ago. It showed 2 teenagers, a boy and a girl, sitting on a rusted fire escape. They were smiling, their heads close together, dreaming of a future they would never share. He looked at it every day. It was his memento. His reminder. It was the only thing in the room that was real. Some men measure their lives in the wealth they accumulate or the power they wield. They build empires of steel and fear, monuments to their own ambition. But true strength, the kind that endures, is not measured in what a man can take, but in what he is willing to give. It is found in the quiet moments of choice, in the decision to honor a promise long thought broken, and in the courage to protect the light, even when one has lived their entire life in the dark. For in the end, a man is not defined by the kingdom he rules, but by the single, fragile life he chose to save.